First things first, what is CSS? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. They come in the file extension of .css, so unlike an HTML file where we use .html, for CSS, we use .css file extensions. HTML is the backbone of every single website, but honestly, it's pretty ugly. CSS lets us create beautiful and modern-looking websites. How this works is CSS is a layer on top of HTML. So we write a regular HTML and then we make it look and act really, really nice by overwriting the default settings that a browser gives us with HTML. We can change all of that with CSS. So CSS, or Cascading Style Sheets, do not control the functionality of a website. So if you want to click a button and you want it to do something, that actually requires JavaScript. Now, JavaScript is definitely worth learning, but you should focus on learning JavaScript after you learn CSS. So you should learn HTML first, then CSS, where you currently are, this course, and then you should learn JavaScript after that. Now, if you don't know HTML, I have several HTML courses, the Ultimate HTML Developer, HTML 101, and HTML 201. So if you don't know HTML, please go back to one of those courses first, or do a little Googling and brush up on your HTML, because we are going to be working with HTML quite a bit here, because HTML and CSS work together. Lastly, CSS can be written in 3 different ways. Now, it all looks the same, but we can apply it 3 different ways. That's a better way of putting it. We have inline with the HTML style attribute, then we have internal with the style element, and lastly, we have external.css files. We're going to tackle all of these in this course. How does CSS work? In HTML 101 and HTML 201 courses, we talked about the different browser rendering engines. So your browser does 3 primary things. Well, it does a lot of things, but when it comes to rendering content, it does 3 primary things. It renders your HTML, it renders your CSS, and it renders your JavaScript. And in this course, we're going to be using HTML and CSS, so it's going to be using the HTML and CSS engines. And just as a little recap, these engines have different rules. So your HTML looks a lot different from your CSS, and your CSS looks a lot different from JavaScript. They have different rules, so we write code differently. And this is the same right across all programming languages, and this is called syntax. We'll talk more about CSS syntax in just a little bit. So CSS is really just a layer on top of HTML. We'll always need to write HTML to make a website, so technically CSS is optional. You don't need to know CSS in order to get a website on the internet. However, and I would argue this, if you want to make a modern looking website, CSS is not optional. You need to know it. Otherwise, your website's going to look like it's from 1997. So as a fun little experiment, go and Google the Space Jam website. It looks like it's from 1997, 1996, somewhere around there. Now, if you want to break into web development for a job, or you want to be a contractor, make a little side money, you 100% absolutely will need to know CSS, and you'll need to be pretty good at it. And this course is the perfect guide to getting started with CSS. Moving through this CSS 101 course, we will tackle the basics and most commonly used attributes. Okay, let's take a look at CSS syntax. So you should already have a text editor by now. You should have already downloaded and installed one when you were learning HTML. And so I'm going to open up my text editor called Visual Studio Code. And what I'm going to do is go to File, Open, and I'm going to open up an entire folder here. And I already have an index.html file. It's completely empty. There's nothing in it. And we can see all this did was give me a little sidebar here called Explorer. You can always go to, I believe it's View and then Explorer to turn this on if it's not there. You do have to open up an entire folder for this though. And I can open up this index.html file and do HTML:5, hit Tab, and it just fills everything that I need for me, which is really nice. And again, this is something we covered in HTML. So what I'm going to do is just ignore this stuff for now. And this is set to a Django template. Let's change this to HTML. And let's take a look at the CSS syntax. So there's 2 primary ways of writing CSS. You can write it right on an element doing the style attribute. You can say style color is equal to red. We'll talk about what color red and all that stuff is in just a little bit. Or you can, in your head section, write a style element. And in here, this is where you're going to write most of your CSS. It's going to look a lot like this anyways. So you have some sort of selector, And I'm going to make this even bigger here. You have some sort of selector, curly brace, the property name, colon, and then whatever the value is going to be, semicolon. And then if you wanted a second one, you could do like property 2, colon, value 2, semicolon. And so this fella here is always your selector. And from here all the way to here, this is called a declaration, where you have a property, a colon, a value, and then a semicolon. And always make sure you have that semicolon. And so this is what your declaration looks like. So whenever I say declaration, I'm talking about a property and a value together. So as an example, we could just go ahead and delete this, and we could say body, and that's going to target this body element. We'll talk about selectors and stuff a little bit later. I just want to show you what this looks like for now. Curly brace, we can put it on a new line if we wanted to, and we could say something like background color is equal to black. And let's go ahead and get rid of this. And I'm just going to load this page up in Google Chrome by going to File, Open File. I'm going to go to my desktop here, go to CSS 101, open up that index file that we were just working on, and we're going to see this background color is all black. And usually by default, it's white. And so this is what CSS does. It lets us do little things like this. So there's nothing to do, nothing to learn. I just really wanted to show you what the syntax looks like. Really, it's just some sort of selector. You're going to select like your body element, curly brace, closing curly brace, and between it we have a declaration. And a declaration is made of some sort of property type. Then it has a colon, and then some sort of value, and then a semicolon. And we could put another one on here on a second line. Color is equal to red if we wanted to. And then we could put a third one here, third value. And we could do this on and on and on. So again, nothing to learn. Let's go ahead and get started with that next lesson where we actually start diving into CSS a little bit more and get a little more hands-on with this. Okay, let's take a look at inline CSS. So from the last video, I just cleaned up this HTML a little bit, got rid of that old CSS. And when I refresh my page, it's a standard HTML page. Literally nothing on it. It is as plain as it gets. So let's go ahead and create an H1 element. So I type H1 and then tab in VS Code, and it creates an H1 element for me. And then I can say style is equal to, and then we can put some sort of element or a property or declaration in here. And we can see there's all sorts of stuff to choose from. This is all CSS, by the way, all of this. We're not going to learn all of this because that's going to take forever to learn, but we're going to learn the most commonly used things that will get you 90% there on pretty much every single website. So I'm going to avoid putting in a style just for now and say this is an H1, and I'm going to copy this down and create another H1. Again, I'm going to give this a blank style attribute. It's not doing anything at this point. This is another H1. And so when I refresh the page, we see an H1 and another H1. Nothing is different from HTML. However, in this style attribute, we can now say something like font size is equal to 10 pixels. We'll talk about font size in its own particular lesson, but I just want to show you that this is how we can write some inline CSS. So I go ahead and refresh this, and you can see that this is still an H1, and if I right click and inspect, in here, it's still an H1. However, it differs from this one. This is a base style H1, this one is an H1, but we gave it a font size of 10. Now we could also change other things, like let's change the color of the second H1. Let's say the color has to be blue. And remember, I'm writing a declaration here. So I write the property name, colon, space, value, semicolon. And I can save that, go back here, refresh my page, and now it's blue. And we can merge these together if we wanted to. It doesn't have to be just one change at a time. If we wanted to add multiple styles or multiple CSS declarations, we can do a semicolon, because that semicolon tells the computer, oh, this is the end of this declaration. Look for another one. So we can say font size is equal to 20 pixels. And even though I don't have a space here, that would work, but I like adding a space and it just looks a lot nicer when you're writing massive amounts of CSS. So let's go ahead and save that, flip back to our browser, refresh, and we're going to see that this is going to be a little bit smaller, not quite as small as the first H1, but a little bit smaller, just like that, and it's still blue. And with my inspect tool open, and again, all I did there was right-click inspect, went to elements, select my H1 that I want to edit, and over here we can see we've got color. We can toggle this on and off. We can change this to, we can click blue and change this to red. And we can change the font size. And so we can toggle all of it off. This is what it looks like by default. We can toggle it back on, and this is what it looks like after our CSS. So effectively, we have written inline CSS. Now, this is a good way to get started, but it is not a best practice. So just keep that in mind. We are going to break this rule throughout this course, and that's totally okay. But in the wild, when you're writing real production style code, you're probably not going to use this too often. Okay, let's take a look at internal CSS. So in the last lesson, we wrote internal CSS, and that's just style is equal to, and then we wrote our regular CSS. We can actually pull this out and put it into internal CSS. So let's do this. In our head, let's write style. And then remember from, I think it was 2 lessons ago, we had a selector, curly brace, then we wrote the property, and then some sort of value. So this is a property, color is a property, 10 pixels is a value, blue is a value. So if we wanted to select all the H1s in this page, we can do that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm going to get rid of this, and I want to show you the before and after. So I just saved that, head on over to my browser, hit refresh, and we can see it's back to normal. Now what I can do here is I can change the selector to like an H1, and this matches the element name. So I can select the body, or I can select an H1, or a paragraph, or bold, or a div. I can do anything like that. Now we changed the color of one of them. We can say color is equal to, or colon, space, which is a lot like saying it's equal to. And then that value could be blue. Semicolon, space, and then a closing curly bracket. And that whole thing here, this is styling all H1s on the page. So this is going to select every H1, this one, and this one, and it's going to say change the color from black to blue. So if we save that and refresh our page here, we're going to see that this turns blue just like that. Now we can add another one in here. We could say, let's target the body this time, and that's going to be our entire HTML element. We could say the body, and just for funsies, let's put this on a different line. We could say the background color is going to be black. And so we can see here that it does work on multiple lines. It's totally okay to have it on multiple lines. You don't actually need the spaces, although I would argue put spaces in there because it makes your code a lot more readable. And we're going to change all of the H1s to have a font color of blue. And then we're going to change the entire page, the entire body, to have a background color of black. And so we don't add a comma after this. We don't do anything fancy. The only way your browser tells or can tell that this is an H1 selector is this closing curly brace. Same thing with your body. It's going to say, oh, there's a body. Okay, open it. Apply your styling. Close it. And so let's go ahead and see what this looks like now. Now, within just a few minutes, we have actually started making style changes to our page. And this is internal CSS. Internal CSS is when you use the style element. Inline CSS is when you use the style attribute like we did in the last lesson. What I would like you to do is give this a shot. Go ahead and change your body background color. You don't necessarily need to know too much about this. Feel free to pause this video and just copy this text right into your document, and then open it up in your browser and see that it actually made a difference. Just get used to writing this particular syntax here, where you have a selector, an opening curly brace, your declaration, a closing curly brace. Okay, welcome back. In this lesson, we are going to be talking about selectors. Let's talk about selectors. I keep saying this word, selectors. So what I'm going to do is, just from that last lesson, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete this. and save that page and just refresh, and we can see that it undid everything. This is a base HTML page now. Now, a selector lets us select different elements. So in here, we've got two H1 elements. We could have a div in here, it says this is a div. We could have a paragraph in here. This is a paragraph. And if you're just joining me now, the way I made that little shortcut there was I type P, and as soon as you see this Emmet abbreviation pop up, you can hit Tab, and it creates your opening and closing tags for you, your HTML tags. Let's go down here and let's create a bold element. Actually, let's use the proper version. Let's use strong. And this is bolded text. This is normal text. And so when I refresh a page, we're going to see we have a standard HTML page. Nothing extraordinary is happening yet. But let's say we want to target just this one div or just this one paragraph, or we wanted to target all of the H1 elements on a page. We can do this with CSS. So we would use an internal style here. And let's say we want to select all of our H1s. So we have two on the page. We would say H1, opening and closing curly brace. And let's change that color to blue. Save, head on over back to our browser, hit refresh, and it changes it to blue. Now let's say I wanted to select just this paragraph and make it real ugly. We could do that too. We could say, select the paragraph, and you notice that these match the HTML element. So this H1 is literally the H1 element, and this P is literally the paragraph element. And let's throw this on just one line this time. We can say, make the paragraph background color. And what color do we want to change this to? Let's change this to, what do we have here? Dark magenta. Make sure you have that semicolon. Make sure you have that closing curly brace. Save. And let's go refresh, and we can see that this text is going to change. Hopefully that is a visual change that we can see in this video. Yeah, there we go. So we have something that's actually working here. Now this is a selector. A selector is the ability to select just particular elements. Now we can select it by an element, we can select it by a class, we can select it by an ID, we can select elements by their attributes if we wanted to. But we're not going to get into that just yet. We're going to tackle these one by one. So what I would like you to do in this video is make an H1, make a div, and then just target that H1 and change the color of it. I do not want you to change the color of the div. Let's talk about class selectors. In the last lesson, we were able to select all the H1s on a page, and we were able to change them. We change the styling, change how they appear. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at how we can select multiple elements using a class. So let's say we have an H1, select me, and below this we have a div, select me too, and we also have a paragraph, don't select me. Now there are several ways we can select both the div and the H1, but in this lesson we're going to look at the class attribute. So if I go into my H1 here, type class, then this is just HTML. We can change this color to blue, and we can also say in the div, blue. And so you see that how they both have blue in common. They're both a class. In our CSS, we can't type H1 and div, although we can do this. This is a different type of selector. We'll talk about this later. We just want to be able to select the H1 and the div, but we want to select it by the fact that they have this common attribute. They have this common class called blue, and we can do that with dot blue. And so I just made a selector here, dot blue, and you can think of class as dot. Now, if you ever watched the TV show called Reboot, you can think of dot is a classy character because classes are dots in CSS. It's just a shorthand method of writing this out. So now we have dot blue selected. It's going to select our H1 and our div. And in here we could say color is equal to blue. Save and refresh this page. And we can see that it says select me is blue, select me too is blue, don't select me is still default black. Now, what if I wanted to make this a little more complicated? Let's add a paragraph in here with some lorem. So I hit lorem, or I type lorem, hit tab, and it creates some lorem ipsum text. And if we preview, it's a regular paragraph. Let's go ahead and select this, but let's make this H1 and the paragraph uppercase. So we can change this by adding a class is equal to, and let's call this uppercase. And this name is not super important, but I'm just going to call it something simple like uppercase. And let's also add a second class selector onto our H1. So we use space, uppercase. And you notice how these two now have something in common. We can go back up to our CSS and we can say class, uppercase, open our syntax there. We can do text transform, and then we have all these different options here. Let's go with uppercase. And let's save that. Let's go back to our page, and we're going to see that select me and this class, this element. So we can see that the H1 select me and this paragraph is going to be uppercase, just like that. So now we've selected this one and we've selected this one, but we have not selected select me to, the second one, or the last one. So this is a good example of how elements can share something in common, and we can apply styling based on that thing that they have in common. We also looked at how we can have two classes or more. You can have more and more and more in here if you wanted to. And the way we separate these is with a space. So we said the first class is going to be blue, the second class is going to be uppercase. So it made our first element here blue and uppercase. The second element only has blue, so we go up here. It only changes the text color to blue. And then in a paragraph, we're saying only uppercase, and it's only changing that to uppercase. It's not changing it to blue. Lastly, we have an element down here, don't select me. And there are no classes, there are no selectors for the P element to change all P elements. So this is just default, whatever the browser is going to give us. Oh, and one last thing here is these are case sensitive. So .uppercase is not the same as uppercase with a U. Make sure they are spelt the exact same. I see a lot of people throughout the years, I've seen them do something like this where it's uppercase and then this one is lowercase u and this one is an uppercase U. And they say, oh, it doesn't work for me. Why is it broken? It's actually not. It's just very case sensitive. So uppercase or even like blue and uppercase B is different. This is saying select blue with an uppercase B. So it is different. So just keep an eye on that. All right, let's take a look at ID selectors. An ID selector is a way to select something based on another HTML attribute called ID. And so we can say in this one here, let's make some space here. We can say the ID for select me is going to be the title. And we do this, we select this one with a number sign. And so in CSS, we can go back to our style element here. I'll just move that up a bit. We can do ID, the title, and this is case sensitive as well. And we can change this to have, let's say, text decoration of underline. So in the last lesson, what we did was we selected this element, and this element, and we applied different styling to it. In this lesson, we're going to select me by its ID, and we're going to give this an underline. So let's go ahead and refresh, and it's now underlined. And the reason that's not blue is because in the last lesson, I was telling you how this is super case sensitive. That was the case here. Let's go ahead and refresh this. Now it's blue, it's underlined, and it's uppercased. And we're using multiple selectors here. So this H1 element has the blue styling, has uppercase styling, and it has an ID called the title. And once again, that ID just starts with the number sign. The rest of the syntax is identical to an element selector, like what we saw originally, a class selector, like what we saw in the last video, and all it is that curly brace, your declaration, and then a closing curly brace. Now, one thing to note about IDs is they should be completely unique. So you can, in theory, write ID is equal to the title, just like we have up here, and this is going to select both of these because they're identical. And we should only ever have one ID. It's like your driver's license or your government ID, like your passport. There only should ever be the one document in existence. And just like an ID here, there should only ever be one. But we're saying that, hey, there's one selector but it's being applied twice. Let's see what happens here. So you can see that our browser did not honor the rule. It actually made this underlined as well. Now that is, I guess that's fine, but please don't do this. What we should be doing is the title, and this could be like the subtitle. IDs should always be unique. Now, why this is important is because after CSS, you're going to be learning JavaScript, and JavaScript has the ability to grab an element by its ID. And if there are two of them, it's only going to grab the first one, and you might possibly want the second one, and that could really mess up your coding and cause hours of frustration. You don't want that. So always make sure your IDs are completely unique. Let's talk about grouping selectors together. So what I'm going to do is from that last lesson, I'm just going to go ahead and delete this code, and I'm going to delete the styling that we have here. Now, let's say there is a circumstance where you have an H1 on your page. This is an H1. You have a div on your page. This is a div. And you have a paragraph on your page. This is a paragraph. And let's say you wanted to select the H1 and the paragraph, and you wanted to change the color to blue. So currently, the way we know how to do that is we can add a class to both of these. So I can click here, and then in VS Code on Mac, I can do Command click, or on Windows, I think it's either Alt or Control click, and you can type in two places at the same time, which is really, really useful. And then we can do class is equal to blue. And that's what we did in the last couple of lessons. But we might not always have access to the class attribute. We might not be able to add anything to this, and there will be circumstances in the future where that's just not possible. So let's say we want to select this H1 and this paragraph. Well, currently we do H1 color is equal to blue. And then on a new line, we do paragraph color is equal to blue. And this does do the job. If we flip back here and refresh from what we previously saw, changes our H1 to blue and changes the paragraph to blue. Okay, cool, that works. There's a better way to do this, because you see how we have to write this twice? What if down the road, you have a CSS file or some styling, and it's like 1,000 lines long, and there's tons of selectors in there. What if you wanted to change all those colors from blue to red? Well, we'd have to go here, type red. If we forget one, oh no, now we have to go back and check. One's red, one's blue. We have to then find this one, go over here, change that one to red as well, go back, refresh our page. You can see how this can just get a little bit monotonous. Instead, what we can do is, let's put this on multiple lines just for readability. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete that. And instead, I'm going to group these selectors together with a comma. So I say select the H1, all the H1s on the page. Also, select all the paragraphs on the page. And we do that with, again, select the H1s, comma, space, then a paragraph. And if we wanted to select more, we could do comma, div. We could select all of them. Or we could do just the bold elements, or just the strong elements, or just the italic elements. We could do that. So what we want here is H1, comma, space, paragraph, or whatever element you want to select, space, and then a bracket. Don't make it end in a comma though. You don't want it to end in a comma. You can actually see that my my editor here has sort of ran into errors. You see those little squiggly lines underneath there? Yeah, it's running into some sort of errors. And so that error is just because I've got that comma there. So let's go ahead, save this, and when I refresh, we should see actually nothing has changed from this. Beautiful, nothing has changed. So this is red and this is red as well. So what I would like you to do is create 3 different elements on your page. Feel free to copy my experiment as well. Create 3 different elements like an H1, a div, and a paragraph. Select 2 of them, and then change the declaration. And then change the font color. And make sure that third one is not selected. Let's take a look at nested selectors. So there's a way to select certain elements that live inside of other certain elements. So I'm just deleting this code here, and what I'm going to do is create an example. I'm going to create a div, and in that div, I'm going to have a paragraph. So I type P, Emmet abbreviation shows up. I can now hit tab. Let's throw some lorem ipsum in here. And I'm going to also create another part that says this is bold. And I'm going to make this bold as well. So B. So strong. Let's go ahead, select that, cut, move to the end of the line, paste, and let's make something in here bold as well. Strong, go to the end of the line, cut, and let's go down here, paste. And what this looks like is this. We have a paragraph with some bold text, and then we've got some text outside of a paragraph. Look at this code real quick. This stuff is outside of a paragraph. It's inside the div, but it's outside of the paragraph. So we've got a paragraph here with an inline strong. Now let's say we just wanted to target me. Let's change this to target me. Well, currently, we know a few different ways of doing this. We could select all of the strong elements. We could give it a class. We could give it a class called selected if we wanted to, or we could add an ID of selected. Or maybe not the same one, not the same name as a class name. That gets a little confusing. Select me. Now we could add a class or an ID to this element. But when you work with frameworks in the future, such as Django, you might not have access to this right away. And so an easier way is to select it by selecting the div and then the paragraph and then this particular element. And so maybe let's just put this on a new line as well, make this a little more readable. And let's get rid of this stuff in here. So let's look at nested selectors. So currently we can select all of our strong elements and we can say the color is going to be blue. And this is great, but it selected this one. Maybe we don't want that one to be selected. Maybe we want just this one to be selected. How do we do that? We can do that without a class. We can do that without an ID. We cannot do that by selecting just the element because there are two different elements here. So what we can do is we can say target all paragraphs and then all the strong elements inside of a paragraph. And we do that by saying P space strong. So we have a P element here, paragraph, that matches right there on line 12. Space, not a comma, not a dash, nothing like that, just a space, then strong. And what's really cool about this in VS Code is you can just put your mouse in here, click, and if you look up here, it says strong P div body HTML. It tells you exactly where this element is living. So we just want to select all the paragraphs. So we're going to select every paragraph on the page. And then we're going to select every strong element inside of each of those paragraphs and turn it blue. And so when we save this and refresh our page, we're going to see that this one will turn black and this one will stay blue. Just like that. Now that is called nesting selectors, and we can go as deep as we want as well. So if we wanted to target just the ME here, we could say this is italics. And if we wanted to target just this one, we could say select all the paragraphs on the page, select all the strong elements inside of each paragraph, and then select all the I elements inside of each strong element. And so again, if I put my mouse there and I click I strong P in reverse order, that's P strong I. And you can see that it matches up here. And so let's go ahead and give this a shot. And now only this is blue. And it inherits the italics that our browser tries to apply by default. So that is nesting. I really want you to give this a shot. So go ahead and create something like this, where we have a div and a paragraph. Make this blue, and then have a paragraph outside of your div. Don't target this. This should not be blue. So I want you to target this one, but not this one. Don't use a class, don't use an ID, use a nested selector.